Can you believe something or someone might be living beside us, not in hiding, but in silence? In the remote Lost Horse Valley of Montana, 1987, an old man named Walter Crowley opened the door of his barn one rainy night. For guests over 7 feet tall, silent and watching, they weren't monsters. They weren't myths. They fixed fences, avoided his garden, and returned what they never took. The real danger wasn't them. It was the humans with traps and rifles. This story comes from Walter's personal journal, found years later in his cabin. He never claimed to be a hero, just a man who understood that not every boundary should be crossed with fear. Stay with me till the end, and you'll see why a lonely man chose to protect something the world said didn't exist, and how one quiet gesture, an open barn door, might have saved a species from extinction. There's even a boy named Caleb, once rescued by an invisible force in the forest, and a night when Walter turned off his only light, so that the hunted could disappear into the dark, safely. But before we go deeper, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? What's your name, dear listener? And how far can this story travel? From a misty valley in Montana to wherever your heart is tonight. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe, not for me, but to help build a community that believes Bigfoot might just be more human than we think, sending you warmth, mystery, and wild wonder wherever you are. By the end of summer, the light in Lost Horse Valley had begun to change. It slanted differently through the thinning aspens, quieter somehow, more golden than bright. Days still held warmth, but it wasn't the kind that stayed with you. It slipped away fast in the evenings, sinking behind the ridge before dinner, and left the valley folded in early shadows and the hush of things preparing to sleep. Even the wind moved differently, less playful, more watchful. Walter Crowley noticed. He always did. He wasn't the type to speak of seasons like poetry, but he moved with them, bone deep. At 67, Walter had lived long enough to know the difference between change and disturbance, and something about the way the birds no longer sang at dawn, or the foxes no longer crossed the creek trail at dusk, felt like the kind that didn't ask permission. He lived alone, not out of bitterness or some noble vow of solitude, but because it suited him. He kept his days tight. Rose at 5, coffee and oatmeal, fence check, livestock feed, split wood, oil the tools, no electricity, no television, a radio he hadn't turned on in months. Everything he needed was either grown, built, or traded for in town. He hadn't been to a city in over a decade, and he never talked to himself, not even in passing, not even when the mule acted up or when his knees cracked like dry timber on cold mornings. There had been someone once, Maggie, but she had left with the rain, in a season much like this one. Not out of cruelty. No storm, no slammed door. Just the slow, aching erosion of two people who loved different kinds of silence. She believed that a roof should be shared, that a fence should not outlast its purpose. She used to say things like, "No one owns a mountain, Walt. You can't keep it, you can only borrow it, right?" He never disagreed. He just built a stronger fence. The valley had never echoed. Even when Walter first came here in the 70s to work timber lines, he'd noticed it. A rifle shot would ring but not return. Shouting didn't bounce. The sound was swallowed by the cliffs like a secret. Some said it was the shape of the walls. Others claimed the earth itself was older here, tired of carrying noise. Walter had grown to respect that. He didn't shout. He didn't blast music. He let the stillness settle and made peace with its rules. But lately the rules were shifting. It started with the tomatoes. He'd planted a late crop in the southeast patch, mostly out of habit. One morning, as he came down with his watering can, he stopped cold. The soil was disturbed, not dug up, pressed, flattened in deep, careful ovals. The shape of a foot, only far too large. The kind of thing a prankster might try to carve with wooden shoes, Except Walter didn't know any pranksters who could reach across a 4-foot garden row without touching a single stalk. Nothing was broken, not a leaf bent. The steps had been made with awareness, with restraint. He didn't mention it. Not to Ruth when she came by with eggs, not to Hank at the feed store. He just filled the can and watered the plants. Then came the dog. It wasn't his, not really. Just a mutt that showed up after Maggie left and never left again. Mostly black with tan paws, scruffy and cautious. Walter never named it. Didn't need to. They understood each other fine. The dog didn't bark much, but it always growled at coyotes or when deer came too close to the fence line. But that night, when Walter lit the lantern and stepped outside to check the stables, the dog didn't growl. It didn't bark. It didn't even whine. It just sat, statue still, in front of the goat pen, eyes fixed on the dark edge of the woods, ears forward, back straight, like a guard waiting for a sign. Walter stood beside it for a long while, listening. He could feel something watching, but the night gave nothing back. No sound, no breath of movement. He turned in early, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning he found one of the fence posts, one of the thick, buried deep corner beams, had been pulled up. Not snapped, not torn out. Lifted gently, and then leaned upright against a birch like it was being inspected. The soil beneath was disturbed, but not scattered, like someone had tried to put it back the way it was. He knelt beside it, touched the earth. Still cold, still damp. He put it back. No questions asked. A week later, the creek ran high after a night of steady rain. Walter was used to runoff carving little paths through the garden, so he went out with a shovel before breakfast. But halfway down the slope, his boot caught something slick in the mud. He stumbled, caught himself, then looked down. A long, shallow rut ran through the wet soil. Not made by water. It was too wide, too deliberate. Something heavy had been dragged. Not by wheels, no tread, just a weight sliding slowly across the earth, pulling along behind something larger. It went from the tree line, through the back pasture, and stopped just short of the barn. Walter followed it with his eyes, then his feet. No blood, no fur. Just a deep, heavy track, and the faintest indentations where something had knelt. One foot, then another, like someone tending to a wound, or protecting something that couldn't walk. He stood there for a long time, hand on the barn door, listening to the quiet. The dog didn't bark that morning either. It just stayed close to the porch, tail low, watching the tree line, watching the valley breathe. That afternoon, Walter sat on the porch with a thermos of black coffee, staring out toward the ridge. The leaves were turning gold at the tips, the kind that fell in sudden flurries with the first real wind. The mountains across the way looked burnt orange in the late sun, and shadows crawled slow down their bellies. He didn't say a word, didn't write anything down, but he brought out a small tin of dried apples and left them by the fence post. That night, when he stepped outside, the apples were gone. Not scattered, not chewed, gone. No footprints, no mess. Just a single smooth stone set in their place. Not local rock. This one was darker, speckled like river basalt, worn smooth like it had traveled far. Walter didn't touch it. He didn't move it. He just went inside, locked the door, and sat with the lantern burning a little longer than usual. The radio stayed off. By week's end, the valley had gone even quieter. Birds vanished. The squirrels no longer darted across the high limbs. Something had shifted the rhythm of things, and the forest was listening. Walter could feel it, like the space between breaths had stretched too long. But he didn't panic. He'd lived through winters where wolves came too close. He'd seen what fear did to men and animals alike. He kept his hands busy, split wood, mended a saddle strap, brushed the mule. But every so often, he would look toward the trees and pause. The valley didn't echo. It never had. But now, it felt like it was holding its breath. like it was waiting for something that had already stepped inside. And whatever it was, it hadn't come to take. It had come to share the silence. And Walter, though he never would have said it out loud, had the strange, heavy sense that something was watching over him, not like a predator, but like a guest trying not to intrude, a guest that had no name, a guest that had bled or carried the wounded, a guest that didn't eat unless left alone. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew better than to shout into a valley that didn't echo. So he lit his lantern, he fed the dog, and when the wind picked up and swept through the hollow just before sleep, Walter simply stood there, listening, until the dark said nothing back. The nights came quicker now, curling in around the edges of the valley like smoke. You'd blink at dusk, and then it was dark. Not the kind of darkness that begged for fire or made children cry. This was different. It was old, settled. The kind that made you hesitate before stepping past your own porch light, even if nothing had ever gone wrong before. Walter Crowley didn't scare easy. He'd slept through blizzards in tents, worked logging rigs where ropes snapped and men didn't come back. He respected danger, sure, but he didn't flinch at shadows. Still, he'd begun noticing the stillness again, that quiet in the bones of the land. And something else too. Each night, just after the moon cleared the trees, he started hearing it. Knock, 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 knock. Always 3. Pause, 2. Pause, 3 again. Steady, clean, like someone wrapping a thick branch on hollow wood, way out beyond the pasture. Not chaotic, not random. Rhythmic. It had a kind of memory to it, like it had been done before, like it meant something. The first night, Walter stood by the window for almost an hour. He didn't see a thing, but the sound kept up. 3-2-3. The pattern so crisp, it made his breath fall into step with it without him meaning to. The second night, he brought out the old flashlight and walked to the edge of the goat pen, boots crunching the first layer of frost lacing the grass. The sound stopped the second he stepped off the porch. Silence rolled out ahead of him like a tarp being pulled tight. He waited, listening to the slow creak of trees settling in the cold. But nothing came. The flashlight beam caught only low mist and the occasional glint of dew. He didn't go farther. The third night he remembered something. Back when he was younger, when timber crews still had to flag routes with hatchets and mark trails the old way, they used signals, not whistles. Too easy to misplace in the wind. Not shouts. Too dangerous to echo. They used knocking. On trees, on beams, on steel poles when they had to. 3-2-3 meant, this space is worked, claimed, not for entry. It was how you marked a cutting line, a border. It wasn't a call, it was a message, territorial, practical, final. So Walter did something he hadn't done in decades. He grabbed his axe, walked slowly to the large pine by the fence line, and raised the handle. Knock, 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 he answered. Then he waited, but no sound came back. No shuffle of leaves, no mimic, no echo, just silence. The next morning the frost was thick on the grass, and his mule refused to move. Walter had hitched the saddle, packed a few supplies, and tried to lead it down toward the northern trail to fetch firewood. But the mule, usually calm, even stubborn, planted its feet and refused to budge. Its breath came out fast and sharp, eyes wide, ears flat. He tugged once, twice, even tried leading it off path a few feet. Still nothing. Then it did something that stopped him cold. It dropped to its knees, not in pain, not collapse. It simply lowered itself like it was yielding. A slow, deliberate refusal to continue north. Walter stood there, hand on the reins, heart doing strange things in his chest. Not fear, something heavier, familiar, like standing at the edge of a property line you didn't own but had crossed one too many times. He didn't force the mule. He let the rope drop and turned back toward the house. The mule rose after a minute and followed behind him, step for step, but only once he turned south. Back at the cabin, things looked normal. The dog was asleep under the porch. The trees hadn't changed, but the valley felt tighter, like it was pulling in its ribs and watching to see what he'd do next. He didn't go back out that day. The knocking returned that night, softer this time, like it was waiting for him to understand, like it knew he'd heard, that he'd answered. But it didn't want conversation. It just wanted confirmation. 3, 2, 3. Walter didn't knock back. At dawn, the fence on the western side had changed. He didn't see it at first. He was doing his rounds, bucket in hand, eyes scanning the frost-bitten garden when he noticed something strange near the chicken coop. One of the fence walls, long leaning and splintered from a bad wind 2 years ago, had been fixed, not just propped, rebuilt. The slats had been stripped of rot, replaced with younger cedar, but not from his stack. He checked. His pile was untouched. These boards had been split by hand, clean and smooth. No chainsaw marks, just axe work, but done with precision. The joints were tight, no gaps. Each beam secured with stones at the base, angled just so. The kind of repair you'd learn from decades of doing it. The kind that doesn't shout but says, "I know what I'm doing, and I did it right." Walter stood there for a long time, hand resting on the top rail. The sun wasn't even high yet, and the air still smelled like wood smoke and pine sap. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He just whispered under his breath, "That's damn good work." And then he stepped back inside and made coffee, stronger than usual. That afternoon, he walked the northern ridge again. Not with the mule this time, on foot. Nothing unusual, no tracks. But he noticed the birds. They perched, sure, but they didn't sing, not even the jays. And down by the creek where the trail usually split, he saw a new formation. Stones set like teeth across the path. Not random, angled, and above them, a limb bent low, pointing away from the route he'd always taken. It wasn't a trap. It was a suggestion. Go left, not right. He took the new path, and when he did, he saw it. The old washout from last winter had deepened, carving a 3-foot drop into the trail just beyond the bend. Had he walked it with a mule, it might have been fatal. A snapped leg, or worse. Back at the cabin, he checked again. His fence was still solid, the chickens calm, the air still. But the wind carried something strange, like the smell of wet fur and cold earth, even though it hadn't rained. That night, he heard it again, but it wasn't knocking. It was silence. Too deep, too full. The kind of stillness that means something is about to speak. Walter didn't light the lantern. He stood near the open window, listening, and from somewhere just outside the tree line, something shifted. Not walked, not breathed heavy. Just shifted. As if changing positions while waiting. As if listening, too. Walter said nothing, made no move. And then, far off toward the barn, a single knock. Not 3, not 2, just 1, like punctuation. And then the night swallowed it whole. He slept with his boots on, just in case. Morning brought another kind of message. Caleb Rourke was missing. Walter heard it from Ruth 2 days later when she came by with a bandaged hand and a basket of late apples. Her boots were caked in mud, and her face tighter than usual. She didn't sit, just hovered by the edge of the porch like she didn't want to cross into something unspoken. "Boy's gone. Been near 2 days now," she said, eyes not quite meeting his. Walter didn't answer. Ruth continued, voice flat. "His daddy's drunk off his mind, says he wandered off. But that boy don't wander, he hides." Walter nodded once. No surprise, just acknowledgement. That night when the knocking didn't come, Walter stayed outside longer than usual. He stood in the dark near the barn, lantern in hand but unlit, letting the moonlight do the work. And somewhere past midnight, he heard the first sound in hours. Not wood, not stone, fabric. Caught. He turned slowly toward the east fence. Something fluttered on the top rail. He crossed quietly, each step deliberate. When he reached it, he didn't breathe. A shirt, small, thin, caught on a splintered edge. He knew it wasn't Caleb's Sunday best, but it was his size, and it had blood. Not soaked, just a smear. Dry now, like a scraped elbow. Or worse. Walter took it down, folded it once, and brought it inside. He didn't tell Ruth. He didn't tell anyone. He hung the shirt near the stove, but not too close. And when the knocking returned 2 nights later, it came faster, uneven, urgent. He knew enough to understand what that meant. Something had changed, and it wasn't asking anymore. It was warning. The valley didn't echo, but it remembered everything. And this rhythm, this silence, this new law scratching its shape across fences and forest, wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger, and Walter, whether he liked it or not, had been counted. Caleb Rourke didn't know how to explain it, not even to himself. But ever since the leaves started to fall, the woods had felt different. Not dangerous exactly. He knew danger, lived with it, but like someone else had taken up residence in the silence. Someone bigger than his father, bigger than town, bigger than rules. He was 13, but looked younger. Long limbs he hadn't quite grown into. Freckles across the bridge of his nose like someone had dusted cinnamon on skin too pale from not enough real food. His hoodie was 2 years too small, sleeves always riding up. The color faded from red to rust orange. He didn't care. Out in the trees, clothes didn't matter. He liked it better that way. Caleb had been sneaking into the woods since spring. He'd found a notch in the back fence where the wire curled just enough to squeeze under, and once he realized no one noticed when he was gone, it became a habit. He never went too far at first. Just the creek behind the broken shed, then the rock with the carvings, then the half-collapsed hunting blind someone had left behind years ago. It became his place. Not to play, not to hide, exactly. Just to stop hearing things. Inside the house, there were always things to hear. The slurred slam of a beer bottle on the counter, the muffled shouts through thin walls, his father shouting at someone on the phone or no one at all. Caleb didn't ask anymore who he was yelling at. It didn't matter. The man was drunk by noon, worse by nightfall. And when Caleb made noise, any noise, he got hit. Not hard, but hard enough to remember not to do it again. Words didn't go far in that house. Silence was safer, so the forest became his escape. He didn't need permission. He just needed the sky, and the wind, and the whisper of leaves that didn't ask questions. Out there he could breathe. Not like a boy pretending to be invisible, but like someone the world forgot in peace. Not neglect. He never meant to go far that day. It was mid-October, the air sharp with the promise of cold rain. Caleb had a sandwich in his backpack and a worn-out flashlight with batteries that worked if you banged it twice. He crawled through the wire gap, slipped down the back slope, and followed the creek like he always did. He was tracing the edge of a fallen log when he saw it, something dark moving beyond the trees. Slow, heavy, he froze. It wasn't a bear. He'd seen a bear once, 2 summers ago, at a distance across the valley floor. This wasn't like that. The thing was upright, not fully, hunched but tall, thick shoulders, long arms that moved differently than a man's, but with thought. Intent. Caleb dropped to his stomach behind a rotting stump, heart in his throat. He didn't breathe for 20 seconds. The figure passed between 2 firs. It didn't run. It didn't even hurry. It just moved, like it belonged, like it had walked that path 1,000 times and never worried who might be watching. Caleb didn't blink. His eyes stung from the strain of staying still. When it disappeared from view, he slowly sat up. His hands shook. Not from fear exactly. Not the fear he felt when his father came home early and angry. This was different. Like his body was trying to tell him he'd just seen something he wasn't supposed to. He could have gone home, should have, but instead, he followed. He moved slow, careful with every step. The leaves were dry enough to betray him, but he knew the quiet paths, the narrow deer trails, the moss that covered stone and softened movement. He stayed low, eyes scanning for more motion. But the forest had gone still. When he reached the slope near the old ravine, he lost the trail. No tracks, no scent, just trees pressing in tighter, like they were hiding something on purpose. Then, without warning, his foot slipped. He slid hard, mud and gravel giving way beneath him, then crashed into a hollow pocket between two boulders. It knocked the wind out of him. His flashlight clattered away. He gasped, chest tight. Pain bloomed up his left side. He tried to move, but couldn't get purchase. The hollow was deeper than he'd realized. Steep on one side, sharp roots jutting like broken ribs. Panic set in, not loud, just creeping. His breath quickened. He clawed at the rocks but slipped again. The backpack snagged on something. He was stuck. And then, before he could call out, before he could even scream for help, a shadow passed over the opening above. He looked up. For a moment, there was nothing, just the silhouette of leaves. Then something shifted, and a figure stepped into view. Huge, dark fur, broad chest, long arms, and not a snout, no animal shape. Just a flat, human-like face, barely visible in the half-light. Wide shoulders that moved slow, deliberate. The thing crouched. Caleb couldn't breathe, but it didn't reach for him. It reached toward the edge of the hollow, picked up a broken branch, laid it across the rocks. And then, just as quietly, it gripped the branch with both hands and levered it under Caleb's pack. Not harsh, not sharp, just enough. He rose. The shift was small, but enough to give him traction. Caleb scrambled up, breath ragged, mud smeared across his arms. By the time he looked back, it was gone. No sound, no trace, nothing but the soft creak of pine and his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. He didn't run. He walked, slow at first, then faster again until he was nearly sprinting through the brush. He didn't stop until he reached the fence. He slid under, scraped his elbow, ignored it, and kept moving. His dad was in the garage. The door cracked open, a cloud of cigarette smoke drifting out. Caleb ducked past the house and went to the shed. Hid inside until his hands stopped shaking. Hours passed. Twilight came and went. When he finally stepped back into the house, his father was in the kitchen, shirt stained with motor oil, half a beer in his hand. He looked up once, then turned back to the counter. Caleb didn't say anything. He went to his room. But the next day, curiosity pulled him back. He waited until noon, then followed the creek again. Not to chase, just to look. That's when he found it. A steel trap, half buried near the base of a cedar, hidden beneath dead leaves. The kind with teeth, old but not rusted. Recently set, his gut twisted. This wasn't for rabbits. He knelt, careful, and disarmed it the way he'd seen on a documentary once. When he picked it up, it was heavier than he thought. He wrapped it in an old towel and stuffed it in his backpack. He didn't know what he'd do with it, only that it shouldn't be there. Back home, he set it on the back porch. That night, his father found it.
"What the hell is this?"
Caleb froze. The trap sat open between them like a question nobody wanted to answer. "Where'd you get this?" the man asked again, voice low. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. "Boy, I swear to God." His father took a step forward. Caleb flinched. He didn't get hit. Not that night. But the next morning the trap was gone, and a half-empty bottle of bourbon was on the table. Caleb didn't ask. But something in the air shifted again. He started watching his father closer. Noticed things he hadn't before. A strange bag in the truck. A second rifle in the garage. Maps on the table marked with circles and arrows. And whispered phone calls where the name Gage came up more than once. That name meant something. Gage used to run dogs through the back trails. Bragged about tagging coyotes, sometimes illegally. Caleb remembered his voice. Loud, oily, mean. The pieces began to connect. The trap, the maps, the anger. They weren't hunting deer, and they weren't scared of what was out there. They were looking for it, trying to catch it, or worse. That night, Caleb stared at the ceiling. eyes wide in the dark. He didn't know what the thing in the woods really was, but he knew what it wasn't. It hadn't hurt him. It could have let him fall, could have left him broken in the rocks. Instead, it helped. It saw him, lifted him, and if people like Gage were coming, Caleb knew who the real monsters were. And they didn't live in the woods. They drank on porches. They laid traps for what they didn't understand. He rolled over, pulled the blanket tight, and tried to sleep. But the sound of the forest stayed with him, quiet, patient, watching. And somewhere out there, he hoped. He really hoped. It was watching them too. Rain came in hard that night. Not the kind that whispered through the pine needles or trickled along the shingles like a lullaby. This was the kind that pounded. It slammed against the windows like it had something to prove. Sheets of it, rushing sideways in thick gusts, cold and relentless. Thunder cracked somewhere near the ridge, long and low like the growl of something waking up after a long sleep. The barn creaked. The animals inside stirred. Walter Crowley stood in the dark kitchen, boots already laced, lantern in one hand, the other resting on the edge of the counter like he wasn't sure yet whether he was going out or trying to talk himself out of it. He could hear the mule pacing inside the stall. The dog, silent again, lay near the back door but wouldn't come to him. That was what finally pushed him toward the rain. That dog had followed him into wildfires and thunderheads. But tonight, it stayed still, watching with eyes that didn't blink. He stepped onto the porch. The wind grabbed his coat and slapped the breath from his lungs. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. He tightened his grip, tilted his head against the rain, and moved toward the barn with slow, measured steps. Something was off, not the weather. He'd known worse. Not the dark. He'd walked that trail blindfolded. It was the air. It had weight. Like someone holding a breath so big it changed the shape of the night. He crossed the gravel path, boots slipping a little in the mud, and reached the barn door. The wood was wet and cold under his palm. He pulled it open just wide enough to step inside and swung the lantern up high, and stopped. Something was there, at the far end near the goat stalls, tall, still. Not a shadow, not imagined, a figure, massive, but not crouched. Not hunched like the one Caleb had seen. This one stood fully upright, framed by the flickering lantern glow like it had always been there. Its fur was streaked with rain, dark in places, matted in others. Broad shoulders curved into arms that hung almost to its knees, the fingers not clenched but loose. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood between the light and the far stall like it had been posted there, guarding something. Walter didn't speak either. He didn't move, not right away. His breath caught, but not from fear. He knew that posture, that stillness. That kind of waiting wasn't for confrontation. It was for permission. He shifted the lantern slightly, the light catching more detail now. Behind the large figure, slumped low against the back wall, was a second one, smaller, breathing shallow. One arm was wrapped across its middle, the other limp at its side. Wet fur clung to its ribs, and the floor beneath was darker, soaked through. Not water, blood. The barn smelled of it now. Wet iron and old pine. Walter didn't know how he hadn't noticed it before. The standing figure looked at him. Not directly, but enough. Like it was measuring the silence between them. Walter took one slow step back, then another. He moved to the left stall, grabbed an armful of dry straw, scattered it across the open space near the corner. Not the middle. Not too exposed. He reached for the old blanket he used when the mule was colicky in winter and tossed it gently onto the straw. Then he placed the lantern on the nail near the door, stepped back outside, and pulled the barn door almost closed behind him, leaving it open just enough. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Inside the cabin, he dried his hands, poured a shot of whiskey he didn't drink, sat in the chair nearest the window and stared into the dark. The wind howled, trees bowed in the gusts. The rain came sideways again, but he stayed still, every sense stretched thin across the yard. Sometime deep into the night, the dog let out a low, guttural sound. Not a growl. Not fear. Something older. Resigned. Walter rose and went to the window. He couldn't see them, not clearly. But there was motion inside the barn. A shadow kneeling. Another adjusting something heavy. The lantern flickered, then stilled. He let them be. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the world was drenched in silence. Fog clung low across the pasture, thick as breath on a mirror. The chickens hadn't come out. The goats were still. The dog sat in front of the door again, but this time facing in, not out. Walter grabbed the lantern and stepped onto the porch. The yard was mud. Heavy, sucking mud. His boots left deep prints, but not the only ones. Near the side of the barn, half sunken in but unmistakable, was a footprint. Human, not Walter's. Too small. A man's boot, deep in the mud, facing the barn. He followed it with his eyes. It wasn't alone. 3 more. Then a drag mark. Something that had slipped or been pulled. Then, nothing. The trail ended just short of the woods. No sign of struggle. No blood. Just a boot print that didn't belong. Walter stood for a long while, the lantern cold in his hand. He didn't go into the barn right away. When he finally did, the space was empty. The stall where he'd laid the straw was undisturbed. The blanket was gone. No footprints inside. No blood. But near the back corner, wedged into the slats where the wall met the floor, was a small stone. Smooth. Black. Set there with intention. He didn't touch it. That night he didn't light the lantern. He sat in the dark, listening to the wind press against the windows, the trees groaning like they remembered something they couldn't forget. And when the dog lay down at his feet, silent and calm for the first time in days, Walter placed a fresh flannel and a jar of dried apples by the barn door, just in case. He didn't expect them to return, but the stall would stay open, because he'd seen what most people never get the chance to. Not a monster, not a story, but something ancient, wounded, protective, and when it stood between him and what was dying, it hadn't threatened him. It had asked, and he'd answered, not with words, but with space, with shelter. And in a valley that never echoed, that answer had been loud enough. By the time the frost started biting deeper into the mornings, Walter Crowley had stopped expecting normal. He still split firewood, still checked the roof for loose shingles, still left grain out for the mule and cracked corn for the chickens. But beneath every routine was the weight of a new rhythm, one he hadn't started, one he didn't control. Something in the valley had shifted, and the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of presence. He woke one morning and found the barn cleaner than he'd left it. Not just swept, arranged. The hay was raked into tidy rows, tighter than his old back could manage, and the feed trough had been scraped clean, even though he hadn't touched it since the storm. A broken rake handle that had been leaning against the door frame for a week was gone. In its place, a new staff, whittled from cedar, smoothed by hand, the grip shaped like it belonged to someone who worked with weight, not decoration. He stood staring at it for a full minute before picking it up. It wasn't a gift. It was a reply. He didn't tell Ruth. Not yet. She was due to come check the swelling in his ankle sometime that week, and the last time she'd asked questions, it stirred up more than either of them had been ready for. Walter knew the rules now. What little there were. If you wanted to be part of this unspoken thing, you had to stop trying to explain it. You had to move inside the hush. And that meant trust. So he started paying attention to what changed after he slept. The next night he left a broken gate latch half hanging on the post by the goat enclosure. Just to see. By morning it had been removed and replaced with a braided strip of bark cord, reinforced by small rocks wedged into the hinge like a natural wedge. It held stronger than metal, and it looked elegant. Not artful, but intentional. He kept walking the fence line. Near the eastern ridge, he found that a loose section had been braced from the inside, not with logs, but with branches woven in a crosshatch pattern, locked tight with stone weights pressed at precise points where tension would hold. No nail, no rope, just pressure and understanding. He'd seen that technique once, in a book about Nordic field walls, but had never been able to replicate it himself. This wasn't from trial and error. This was from knowledge. The days went quiet. No more signs of blood. No more muddy footprints. But the dog still refused to walk beyond the second fence gate, and the mule had taken to sleeping with its back to the barn door, as if watching over something just out of view. Walter adjusted his routine without saying so. Started leaving extra grain in a second bucket. Left the stall open on purpose. Left a folded tarp in the corner, weighted by a brick. Not an invitation, not a trap. Just an option. At night, he'd wake sometimes around 3 a.m. Not from noise, but from absence. A stillness so absolute it pulled him upright in bed. He'd sit in the dark, heart steady, eyes open, and listen to the timbers of the house creak under frost. And he'd know something had passed by. Not to harm, to tend, to check, to fix. One morning, after a heavy windstorm had torn down part of the trail fencing along the West Creek, he bundled himself up and headed out to inspect the damage. But the moment he reached the crest of the slope, he stopped short. The trail had been diverted, not destroyed, not blocked, rebuilt. Someone, or something, had dragged thick fallen limbs into a gentle curve, redirecting the path away from the soft bank that had eroded into a dangerous slope. New stones had been placed along the edge, not haphazardly, like breadcrumbs leading the right way. Walter followed it slowly, boots sinking in the wet ground. As he rounded the bend, the familiar gurgle of the creek grew louder, and just before the last turn, he saw something that made him stop cold. A branch, split at the center, had been bent over and tied with grass cord into a narrow triangle. At first glance, it looked like wind damage, but Walter had seen enough field signals to know this one. It meant danger ahead. And sure enough, the ground just past that triangle had collapsed into the creek overnight. If he'd taken the old route on horseback, he and the mule would have gone straight into the freezing water. He didn't touch the triangle. He backed away, quiet and careful. And when he got back to the cabin, he sat on the porch a long while, staring out toward the woods with a kind of awe that didn't have words. They weren't just surviving. They were guiding. That night, Walter left out 2 apples, cut and peeled, on the flat stump near the barn. The next morning, the apples were gone. In their place, stacked precisely, were 4 stones. 1 black, 1 white, 1 red, 1 gray. Not local rock. Each the size of a walnut. Each placed like punctuation. He took them inside and set them on the windowsill above the sink. He didn't know what they meant. Not yet. But he knew better than to throw them away. He started sleeping with one ear open. The nights grew colder. Leaves fell faster. One morning, after a bitter frost, Walter woke up to find a child's coat snagged on the western fence. He didn't have visitors. He didn't have children. The coat was small, yellow, torn at the sleeve, the kind of jacket you'd find in the clearance bin at a gas station store. It smelled of pine and smoke. He stared at it a long time before he touched it. Inside the collar, a name stitched in fading thread. Caleb. Walter didn't need to guess. He didn't call anyone. He didn't mention it to Ruth when she came by later that week, though she eyed the coat drying by the fire and said nothing. That silence said plenty. That night the knocking came again, but it was different now. Faster. Not chaotic, but urgent. The rhythm had changed, and Walter, who hadn't spoken into the valley in weeks, found himself stepping onto the porch with a lantern in hand, raising it high and nodding once toward the trees. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. By now he understood. Something had shifted again. The quiet was no longer enough. He was part of it now. And whether he liked it or not, the valley was drawing its lines deeper in the dirt. He left the barn door open, slept with the lamp unlit, and listened to the soft, steady hammering of work being done out in the dark. Repairs made not with nails or plans, but with care, with memory, with the kind of labor that didn't expect thanks. They fixed what they could while he slept, and something in him began to wonder how many times they'd done it before, how many fences had stood because of hands no one saw, How many paths had stayed safe because something older had chosen to guard instead of flee? In the still of night, with only wind and firelight to keep him company, Walter understood something simple and terrifying and beautiful all at once. The valley was watching, and it was fixing more than broken wood. It was fixing him, and it wasn't done yet. The first time Ruth Ellman ever saw the inside of Walter Crowley's cabin, she didn't knock. She didn't have to. It was raining sideways, a cold, mean rain that stripped color from the sky and turned the air thin as paper. She pushed the door open like she'd been doing it for years, and the moment she stepped inside, she kicked the mud off her boots and looked at him with that same flat look she used on men twice her size when they thought she didn't know how to dress a wound. "Foot still swollen?" she asked, already setting the satchel on the kitchen table. Walter didn't answer right away. He nodded once, slow, sat back down in the chair by the fire. He wasn't surprised to see her. She'd said she'd come. When Ruth said she'd do something, she did. That was the way of it. She worked in silence, checking the ankle, wrapping it again with fresh cloth. Her fingers were quick, firm, and clean. No wasted movement. She'd once told him she'd learned more from stitching up horses than people, and he believed it. When she was done, she didn't rush to leave. She stood at the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the tree line like she could see through the fog and into the truth. "You've been keeping something in that barn," she said. Not a question. Walter didn't move. "And I ain't here to ask what." Still, he said nothing. She nodded once, like she'd expected that. Then turned back toward the stove, poured herself a cup of coffee like it was her house too. The rain outside was relentless, tapping on the roof like impatient fingers. "I heard something last week," she said after a long while. "Out near the edge of county line. Sounded like branches snapping, not trees falling. Big weight, careful steps, and then nothing, just gone." Walter watched the fire. "I also heard," she continued, "someone's been paying trackers." That got his attention. He didn't lift his head, but the breath in his chest went still. Not hunters, not locals, outsiders. Gage is mixed up in it. Of course he is. He's got no use for silence. Likes to stir things up, make himself feel important. He's been taking them back trails. They're looking for something, Walter, and they think it's a threat. She didn't have to say what. He already knew. Ruth moved to the table and sat down across from him. The air between them was heavy, full of things not said. "They're calling it a beast. Something unnatural. They've got rifles, scopes, bait. One of them brought night vision, if you can believe that. And they're not out there to study. They're out there to prove a point." Walter's jaw clenched. His hand stayed still in his lap. "I know you, Walt. I know the way you look when you're carrying something heavy but won't speak it. And I know the way this valley moves when something's changed." She looked around the room then, her eyes lingering on the folded blanket near the door, the way the tools were stacked by the window, the faint marks on the floor that didn't match Walter's boot size. She didn't ask. She never had to. "I lost my son in woods like these," she said quietly. "Not here, but not far. 6 years old. We thought he was playing behind the garden. He wasn't. We found his shoe near the ravine. We never found the rest." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. "I know what it means to be too late. I know what it means to ignore signs because they don't fit the shape you're used to. I won't do that again." The fire popped. Rain streaked down the windows in crooked lines. "They're going to find what they're looking for," she said, almost to herself. "Even if they have to invent it. And when they do, they'll shoot. Not because it's right. Because they're afraid. Because killing something is easier than understanding it." She stood, adjusted the strap on her bag, and paused by the door. "I saw your barn the other night," she said. "Lantern light, movement. But you were inside, weren't you?" Walter didn't deny it. Ruth didn't expect him to. She looked back at him one last time, eyes sharp but not unkind. "There are lines we draw, and then there are lines that are drawn for us. Some you cross, some you guard." Then she said it. The line that chilled him more than the rain or the gunfire or the blood he hadn't spoken of. "There's a man in that group who said, 'I'll shoot anything that stands taller than a fence.'" She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The door closed behind her, and the silence came back thicker than before. Walter sat alone for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the barn, and checked every corner again. The straw was undisturbed. The trough was empty. No footprints, no new stone. But the feeling was there, the sense that the quiet wasn't peace anymore. It was pause. He left the gate unlocked. That night the knocking didn't come. The tree stayed still. But sometime just before dawn, the mule brayed once, sharp and low. And when Walter opened the window, he saw it, a dark shape at the edge of the woods. Not close, just watching. Then it turned, slow and deliberate, and vanished into the fog. He didn't sleep after that. The next morning, the barn smelled faintly of cedar and old blood. And on the fence post, wedged into the wood, was a strip of yellow fabric. He knew that coat. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at it until the sun came up through the mist like a warning instead of a promise. And deep in his chest, something old and tired and furious began to rise. Because he understood now, this wasn't a valley of peace anymore. It was a line, and someone had just stepped over it. The first snow came early, not a blanket, just a dusting, soft and uncertain, like the sky wasn't sure if it meant it yet. It clung to the grass before vanishing, left streaks of white along the northern slope, melted by noon. But it was enough. Enough to change the way the air moved, enough to make the animals restless, enough to remind Walter Crowley that time was no longer on his side. He'd been sleeping lighter. Nights fractured into short bursts. The old house creaked like it had arthritis, and the dog had taken to pacing, tail low, eyes twitching toward the window every time the wind shifted. There hadn't been knocking for days. Just absence. And that, in its own way, was worse. That morning, Walter stepped onto the porch and saw them. Not clearly, just motion. A figure at the edge of the trees, low to the ground, stumbling. Then another behind it, larger, limping heavily, one arm cradling the other. He didn't think. He moved. By the time he crossed the pasture, his boots had soaked through. The air was sharp, and the sun hadn't yet burned the fog from the valley floor. He reached the barn and opened it wide. Not just a crack this time. He laid down fresh straw, brought out the tarp he'd folded weeks ago, placed it gently over the inner stall like someone might a quilt over a sick child, left a jar of water, a tin of dried meat. He didn't look back toward the woods. He didn't need to. By nightfall, the barn was quiet again, but it was not empty. He didn't go in. He sat on the porch, lantern unlit, jacket buttoned to the throat, and waited. The moon was just a sliver, thin as a blade. Somewhere in the dark, a branch cracked. Not far. He stood slowly, reached for the second lantern, the one he kept with fresh oil, and lit it. The flame caught on the first try. He held it high and stepped into the yard, letting the light spill across the grass, over the fence, across the pasture. He wasn't signaling them. He was warning someone else. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The dog growled, not toward the barn, toward the ridge. Walter turned, eyes narrowing. He didn't hear it at first, just felt it. The shift in air, the tightness in his gut. Then, soft at first, the click of metal, like something being cocked into place. A rifle. Close! He dropped the lantern. Darkness rushed in, fast and full. He didn't hesitate. He moved, crossed the yard in 5 steps, slid into the barn and slammed the door shut behind him, heart thudding. Inside, it was warm, still. The straw had been pushed aside. The tarp shifted slightly in the shadows. He didn't speak. He crouched low, eyes adjusting. Then he heard it. Footsteps, outside, crunching slow in the frost. Someone circling the barn. Not fast, not afraid. Deliberate. The dog growled again, sharper now. A voice. Not loud. "Come out, Crowley. We just want to talk." He didn't answer, didn't move. Another footstep, then silence. And then, from the field, another sound. Breath. Heavy. Not from a man, from something else. From something that had survived too many nights and was done hiding. It was close now. He felt it before he saw it. A shadow moved beside him, massive, slow. A figure brushing past, just beyond reach. The barn seemed to shift around it. Walter held still. The back door creaked open. He hadn't touched it. A gust of cold air poured in. Then, footsteps. Heavy, fast, gone. Silence. Walter waited. Counted. 1 minute. Then 2. The night didn't breathe again for a long time. When he finally opened the barn door, the yard was empty. But the fence was broken, not from violence, from pressure, and in the mud, fresh now, churned by motion, he saw the mess of tracks. Not just 1 pair of boots, 3, maybe 4, scattered, some running, some falling, and overtop all of them, clear and wide, the prints of something larger, something walking away. He followed them with his eyes. They led toward the ridge, toward the deep trees. He didn't chase. He just stood there as the wind kicked up and the valley exhaled again, like it had been holding that breath for far too long. By morning, the barn was empty. No tarp, no straw, no blood. Just one thing. A small bundle, wrapped in leather, left at the foot of the door. He opened it slowly, fingers stiff. Inside, a stone, smooth, black, one edge chipped like it had once been part of something sharp. And next to it, folded tight, a strip of cloth, yellow, from Caleb's coat. Walter sat down hard on the step, not crying, not shaking, just still, like everything inside him had finally stopped moving. He didn't ask what it meant. He already knew. Some debts are paid in silence. Some boundaries are drawn not in ink or wire, but in trust. And when broken, they do not scream. They vanish. They leave you with space, with memory, and with the cold. He rose slowly, bones aching, closed the barn, locked it for the first time in months, then turned toward the woods and listened. But the trees didn't answer. Not this time. They had done what they came to do. And now, they were gone. There were no fireworks when they left. No howls in the night. No scorched earth or broken limbs. Just silence, stretched thin across the valley like a sheet pulled tight over something that once breathed there. Walter Crowley grew old in that silence. The years slid by like autumn leaves caught in a slow creek, tumbling without urgency. Winter came and went. Spring softened the edges of the mountain, and the river whispered its way through thaw. But the barn door still opened every October, and Walter still laid straw in the corner stall, still folded a flannel blanket, and set a clean jar of water just inside. Most years they never came, but he did it anyway. He never spoke to anyone about it, never answered the few neighbors who asked why his tool shed light flicked on at midnight, why he still left food out by the fence post even after the tracks stopped showing up. Some of them probably figured he'd gone strange with age. Solitude had a way of dressing grief in layers people couldn't see through. He didn't correct them, because sometimes, late into the cold months, he'd wake and find things moved. The rake he left beside the barn sat upright. The stall swept clean though he hadn't touched it. One year, after a windstorm tore down a pine near the goat pen, he woke to find the entire trunk stripped and stacked neatly beside the woodshed. Bark peeled with care, split clean. A job that should have taken a man a full day. No footprints, just the scent of cedar. Sometimes it was nothing more than a stone. Black, smooth, tucked near the porch step. Other years, nothing at all. But he never stopped making room. He had no pictures of them. No sketches, not even a name. Just the slow, quiet certainty of what had happened, and the weight of being trusted with it. One year a man came up from town, Caleb Rourke, older now, wiry and hollow-eyed, voice lower than Walter remembered. He stood with a hand in his coat pocket like he didn't trust it to stay still. His face was the kind men wore after war, even if they'd never seen combat. Walter hadn't expected to see him again. The boy had vanished after that final season, swallowed whole by whatever mess his father's hunting parties had stirred up. Rumors said the old man had died out on the North Ridge, tripped his own trap. No one found him until spring thaw. Some said he'd been torn apart. Others whispered about claw marks. Walter never added to the stories. Caleb didn't say much. He handed Walter a folded flannel, bright yellow, faded and frayed, and looked away when he spoke. "I think I owe you something." Walter didn't ask what. The boy, now a man, hesitated, then added, "I think someone was watching me back then, more than once. I didn't know what I was seeing. I just know I wasn't alone." Walter nodded, poured him a coffee, set the cup down on the porch railing. They didn't speak for a long time after that, just sat in the cold with their coats zipped to the chin, watching the wind bend the grass in soft, familiar ways. That year, the apples Walter left in the barn stayed untouched, but the woodpile doubled overnight. A quiet gesture, not goodbye, just acknowledgement. Another year came when he couldn't make it up the ridge anymore. His knees gave out in the frost, and his balance betrayed him when the snow thickened. Still, he limped to the barn, took his time brushing out the corners. He set out the blanket slower now, hands shaking a bit more, but he did it. He didn't expect them to come anymore, but he figured they still might be watching, and that was enough. Then came the year the food went untouched, but someone left a bundle of dry kindling wrapped in moss beside his porch. The year after that, nothing. No stones, no sounds, no moved tools, just silence again, like breath holding or memory fading. He didn't take it as loss. He took it as peace. One night, deep in October, wind pushing low through the trees like it had somewhere to be, Walter stood outside with the lantern lit and the dog long gone. The pasture was empty. The fence held strong. The valley didn't echo, never had, but it hummed with that old, low thrum, like something deep beneath the soil was still remembering. He went inside, put on the kettle, sat by the fire and closed his eyes. And that's when he heard it, faint, distant, knock, 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 knock. 3, 2, 3. Not a greeting, not a warning, just a rhythm. One last time. He didn't rise. He didn't speak, but his chest eased as if something old inside him had been exhaled. A promise, long held, confirmed. A boundary still honored. He slept deeper that night than he had in months. And when he woke the next morning, the barn was untouched. The blanket still folded, the water still full. But something had changed. He stepped outside, blinking into the sunlight. The grass glittered with frost. The wind carried no scent, and the valley felt full, not in sound, in memory, like it held something in its soil now, something shared. He didn't see them again, not with his eyes, but the door stayed open each fall, the stall swept clean, a place kept ready, because Walter understood something most people never would. We don't always need to meet again to prove we once respected each other. Sometimes the silence we leave behind is louder than the noise we made together. And in a valley that never echoed, that silence never faded. It just kept the door open, year after year. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. They don't raise their voice. They don't demand to be remembered. But they settle somewhere deep, beneath the noise, beneath the logic, and take root where empathy lives. This was never a tale about fear. It was never about monsters or legends or proving anything to anyone. It was about something older than explanation, quieter than proof, about the unseen acts of care that unfold in silence, about the invisible boundaries we honor not because someone told us to, but because something within us understands the weight of shared space, of trust offered and never spoken aloud. There's a kind of dignity and restraint in learning that not every question needs to be answered, that sometimes the most sacred truths are the ones we don't name. Respect doesn't always show up in grand gestures. It shows up in the way we leave a place better than we found it, in the way we watch over something we can't own, in the way we listen without interrupting. The world will always offer us reasons to shout, to divide, to hunt for what we don't understand. But there's power, real power, in choosing to respond with stillness instead. with kindness, with quiet protection. It's not weakness to be gentle. It's not foolish to believe that something wild might be watching, might even care in its own way. Because whether it's across a field, behind a fence, or in the unseen corners of a heart, what matters most isn't being seen. It's being respected. And maybe that's the heart of it all. Knowing when to speak and when to simply leave the door open. Year after year, even if no one walks through, even if the ones we cared for vanish into myth or memory, the door stays open. Not because we're waiting, but because we remember. Because we choose to. We live in a world that tells us everything has to be explained, measured, proven. But maybe, just maybe, not everything should be. Maybe some things deserve to be felt, not solved. Trusted, not tested. Held in the soft space between what we know and what we're willing to believe. And maybe that's enough. If this story meant something to you, even a small tug in your chest, a quiet memory of something you can't name, I'd love to hear what you felt, what you saw behind the silence. Leave a comment. Let your voice be part of the quiet echo this story carries. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, human, raw, and full of that slow-burning wonder we often forget to look for, follow along, subscribe, stick around. There's always room by the fire for one more listener. Thank you for being here.